What just happened in Washington may sound like another distant political headline, but it carries consequences that reach far beyond Capitol Hill. A single vote has the potential to quietly shape how quickly your benefits move, how reliable public services feel, and how steady the government workforce remains in the years ahead. And most people haven't connected those dots yet. Welcome back to U.S. Pension Insight. I'm Michael Harris. Today, we're slowing everything down and walking through a congressional decision that could influence Social Security processing, veterans care, and the day-to-day functioning of federal agencies in ways that aren't obvious at first glance. This isn't about panic, and it's not about partisan cheerleading. It's about understanding what changed, why it matters, and how it could eventually touch your life. And before we go any further, make sure to hit like, share this video with someone who depends on government benefits, and subscribe to U.S. Pension Insight so you don't miss important updates like this. A few days ago, the House of Representatives passed a bill called the Protect America's Workforce Act. On the surface, that title sounds routine, almost forgettable. But the vote itself was anything but. The bill passed with a narrow but meaningful margin, and what made it stand out was that it wasn't strictly divided along party lines. A group of Republicans joined Democrats to support it, which is increasingly rare when the issue involves labor rights or the federal workforce. That alone signals that lawmakers understood the stakes went beyond symbolism. To understand why this vote happened, we need to rewind a bit. Earlier this year, President Trump signed a set of executive orders that dramatically reshaped labor rights inside the federal government. Those orders were introduced in stages, first in the spring and then expanded later in the summer. Together, they stripped collective bargaining rights from a massive portion of federal employees. We're not talking about a small subset of workers. We're talking about well over 1 million people, possibly closer to 2/3 of the entire federal civilian workforce. Under those orders, more than 40 federal agencies were instructed to cancel or terminate their existing union agreements. The official justification was national security. The administration leaned on a decades-old law from the late 1970s that allows presidents to restrict union activity in agencies connected to intelligence or security operations. On paper, that authority exists. The controversy came from how broadly it was applied. Instead of focusing narrowly on intelligence agencies, the orders swept in departments that most Americans wouldn't instinctively associate with national security. Agencies like the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Treasury Department, the Department of Commerce, parts of Homeland Security, NOAA, and sections of the State Department were all affected. These are offices filled with people processing claims, running hospitals, tracking storms, managing benefits, and handling paperwork that millions of Americans rely on every day. That's when lawmakers started asking hard questions. If these workers are primarily doing administrative, medical, or technical jobs, how does removing their bargaining rights make the country safer? Or was something else driving the decision? For critics of the executive orders, this felt less like a targeted security measure and more like a broad attempt to weaken unions across the federal government. Supporters of the orders framed the issue differently. From their perspective, unions were a barrier to efficiency. They argued that collective bargaining slowed down reforms and protected inefficiency. One concept that came up repeatedly was official time, which refers to hours federal employees are allowed to spend on union-related duties instead of their regular assignments. Critics highlighted statistics showing millions of hours spent on this activity and framed it as a costly misuse of taxpayer money. At first glance, those figures can sound alarming. When you hear numbers in the millions or costs in the hundreds of millions of dollars, it naturally raises eyebrows. But numbers without context can be misleading. When lawmakers dug deeper, they pointed out that those hours represent a tiny fraction of total federal work time across an entire year. In budget terms, the cost is a microscopic slice of overall federal discretionary spending. In other words, while the spending is real, it's not the kind of expense that typically triggers sweeping structural changes, unless there's a larger philosophical goal at play. Supporters of the House bill argued that collective bargaining in the federal system is often misunderstood. Federal unions don't negotiate salaries. They can't demand higher pensions. They can't call strikes. What they mainly address are working conditions, scheduling, safety protocols, and processes for resolving disputes. These issues may not grab headlines, but they strongly influence morale, retention, and institutional stability. That brings us to one of the most important parts of this discussion: turnover. When experienced workers leave government service, they take decades of knowledge with them. One lawmaker referenced what happened in Wisconsin more than a decade ago when public sector bargaining rights were sharply reduced. The result wasn't leaner, more efficient government. Instead, there was a wave of departures, especially among seasoned professionals. Schools struggled to fill positions, applications dropped, and services suffered. Once that experience walks out the door, replacing it is expensive and slow. For many lawmakers, that history raised alarms. The concern wasn't only about fairness to employees. It was about whether government agencies can function effectively when workers feel unstable, demoralized, or constantly bracing for the next abrupt policy shift. Stability may not sound exciting, but it's essential for institutions that handle everything from retirement checks to medical care for veterans. What made this moment especially revealing was how federal workers themselves responded. After the House vote, online forums and internal discussions lit up. Some workers expressed genuine relief, not because they thought the bill would magically fix everything, but because Congress had at least acknowledged what was happening. For them, the vote felt like a sign of recognition, a reminder that their concerns hadn't gone completely unnoticed. At the same time, that relief was tempered by realism. Many workers immediately assumed the bill would face a presidential veto. Based on past statements, that assumption is reasonable, and without overwhelming support in both chambers of Congress, overriding a veto would be extraordinarily difficult. So what emerged was a strange emotional mix. Appreciation for the gesture paired with the expectation that it might not lead to lasting change. That emotional back and forth has become common in federal service. Workers feel caught between shifting political priorities, legal battles, and long-term reform plans that seem to redefine their roles every few years. Some employees have connected this fight to broader proposals aimed at restructuring the federal government altogether. Whether or not those proposals ever materialize, the fact that workers are discussing them openly speaks volumes about how uncertain the environment feels. There's also the lingering exhaustion from repeated budget standoffs and shutdown threats. Anytime Congress debates issues tied to federal employment, workers start worrying about pay delays, furloughs, and financial instability. Even when shutdowns don't happen, the constant possibility takes a toll. It affects mental health, long-term planning, and household finances, especially for employees who don't have large savings to fall back on. If you're not a federal worker, you might be wondering why any of this matters to you. The connection isn't always obvious, but it's very real. When agencies experience high turnover or declining morale, the effects ripple outward. Social Security claims take longer to process. Disability reviews pile up. Veterans face delays in appointments and benefits. Disaster response slows. Permits, payments, and approvals back up, affecting businesses and individuals alike. Critics of unions argue that protections can sometimes shield underperforming employees and make it harder to implement necessary reforms. That concern shouldn't be dismissed outright. Accountability matters in any large organization. But there's a difference between accountability and instability. Stripping protections without addressing management quality, training, or outdated systems doesn't automatically lead to better performance. In some cases, it makes problems worse. At its core, this House vote represents a deeper disagreement about how government should function. One side believes stronger executive control leads to faster decision-making and efficiency. The other believes durable worker protections create consistency and better long-term outcomes. Both perspectives contain elements of truth, which is why this debate keeps resurfacing in different forms. It's also important to understand that this didn't unfold in isolation. Earlier in the year, a federal judge temporarily blocked the executive orders only for a higher court to later allow them to move forward. As a result, some agencies have already terminated union contracts, while others remain in limbo. Even with congressional action, uncertainty continues to hang over large portions of the federal workforce. As the bill moves to the Senate, its future is unclear. Support there is limited, and the political math is challenging. Union leaders are warning that if this effort fails, future administrations may feel emboldened to go even further using executive authority alone. That raises fundamental questions about the balance of power between Congress and the presidency, and about where federal workers fit within that structure. These may sound like abstract constitutional debates, but they have very practical consequences. They influence how stable government jobs are, how services are delivered, and how predictable the systems are that millions of Americans depend on for income, healthcare, and support. Understanding these dynamics doesn't require choosing a side. It requires recognizing that decisions made quietly in Washington can reshape everyday experiences in ways that take years to fully show up. That's why conversations like this matter, even when they feel heavy or complicated. If you have thoughts on this, whether you feel hopeful, frustrated, or just worn down by it all, share that in the comments. Your perspective matters. Thanks for spending this time with me, and thank you for being part of the U.S. Pension Insight community.